So if you know anything about me, I really don't like Reddit. I think it can have some good memes, but I think most of the time a lot of the people on Reddit are not that great. I think where Reddit is right now in its life cycle, it's almost like a continuation of 4chan, and I don't really want to have anything to do with that. That being said though, occasionally you can find some good wholesome subreddits that are great, or sometimes there's just some cool stuff on Reddit that isn't necessarily nice and wholesome, but the concept itself is pretty interesting. And one of those pretty interesting things that's happening on Reddit is something I want to talk about today. I think something that's like pretty well known on Reddit is like spooky stories. You have the No Sleep subreddit, there's a lot of like creepypasta subreddits and SPC Foundation subreddits, and of course you have the Two Sentence Horror Story subreddit. I've said it many times, but I am not a horror fan. That being said, I am always a fan of a good story. And because it is spooky season, I thought it might be fun to look at some of these horror stories and try to write better ones. Because while I was reading through these 1-sentence, 2-sentence, and 3-sentence horror stories, they were not good. To be fair to all of the writers, they're amateur writers, they're not like professional writers, so they're just doing their best and they're just trying to have a good time. And there were actually like a few that I did enjoy, but most of these horror stories I didn't like for pretty specific reasons. My main gripes with these very short horror stories is the same gripes I have with just the horror genre in general. I think what makes horror good is the story that you tell. I think where horror falls flat a lot of the time is that it's just shocking and scary, but doesn't actually have like a good story to go along with it. I mentioned this in my video about the Black Phone, but it's almost like since this horror movie is already going to get an R rating simply because of the subject matter, a lot of directors feel like they're just going to throw in as many awful and terrible things as they can, even if it's to a detriment to their own story. And I feel like a lot of these horror stories on Reddit follow that same kind of thought line. If I can be super duper shocking or super duper gory or super duper gross, that's horror. And to me, that's just not a good way to tell a story. Sure, being super gory and gross and disgusting is scary, but it's not a good story. So in my opinion, that's where a lot of these stories fall flat. Another gripe I have with these short stories is some of them don't actually feel like a story. They feel like 2 sentences that have been taken out of a story instead of just like a complete story in itself. If you're going to tell a story in a paragraph or less, you need to make sure there's actually a story there and not just like 2 creepy sentences, one after the other. 1 sentence by itself can give you a lot of background on a character, and then your second sentence can be used for your twist. This is why I think 2-sentence horror stories are actually like the most popular. You can use it a lot like how comedians use one-liners. There's a setup on the first half and then a punchline on the back half. And while I was looking at these 1-sentence, 2-sentence, and 3-sentence horror stories, I saw that they had linked 4-sentence horror stories. I was kind of curious to see how many subreddits there were dedicated to a specific number of sentence-long horror stories. Turns out the max number was 7. I couldn't find an 8-sentence horror story or above. What was especially funny to me is there were practically no posts on anything past 4-sentence horror stories, which just gives a little bit more credence to what I was saying earlier, to where I think 2-sentence horror stories are actually like the best for this format. But with all of that out of the way, I kind of wanted to like take you through these different subreddits, kind of explain to you the type of stories that were happening there, why I didn't really like them, and if I did like any, why I liked them, and then I want to give you the ones that I wrote, and then we can see how they compare. Some ground rules. These are horror stories, there's going to be some gross and disturbing imagery in them. That being said, I will always give trigger warnings before my story or a particularly triggering Reddit story is read. This video has chapters in it, so if you see a warning for a trigger that you have, you can just go ahead and skip to the next chapter. I will also be doing my best to skip over as much of the triggering content as I can that's on Reddit, because like I was saying earlier, a lot of these horror stories are mostly just nasty things happening to people, trying to be as shocking and disgusting as possible to get the biggest reaction as possible, and I will not be reading those because they're gross and I don't like them. And if you think my stories don't even qualify as horror, they're technically thriller. Or if you're like, that's technically 2 sentences because you used a quote, that's a run-on sentence. And my final excuse for reasons why you're not allowed to judge my writing is that I did in fact write these at 3 o'clock in the morning because I couldn't sleep. Here's proof. But now we're gonna go ahead and get into our stories. I was really debating whether or not I should start this video at my 7-sentence horror story or at my 1-sentence horror story. I thought it would be cool to kind of count down from 7 sentences, seeing how you could take away details but still tell a complete story. My only problem with that is I really feel like my 7-sentence horror story is the best, and I'll tell you why. I started out with the 1-sentence horror story and I worked from there. So I think around like 4 or 5 sentences into this project, I like really got into a groove and was like coming up with a lot of ideas. So I think by the time time I got to 7, I was like in a very creative headspace, whereas at sentence 1, I was just kind of like trying to think of something to do. That being said, we're gonna start out with 1-sentence horror stories. I wrote 2 different ones for this one because I couldn't decide which one was better. I will say that neither of these stories are the best ones I wrote last night, but you know, you do what you can with 1 sentence. So reading along in these 1-sentence horror stories, I think one of the biggest problems with a 1-sentence horror story is it's hard to have a proper twist. I feel like a lot of the Reddit 1-sentence horror stories really tried to have a really big twist. Again, going really hard into the shock factor and not really much else story-wise. I sorted all of these subreddits by top of all time, and I was severely disappointed on these 1-sentence horror stories. Again, they weren't really scary, they were just gross. So I'm gonna go ahead and read you mine, and I will give commentary. It probably isn't necessary, and honestly, for most stories it shouldn't be necessary, but I like to over-explain things. If needed, sanding sugar can easily be swapped for crushed glass in this recipe. This is the kind of horror that I enjoy. It's gross if you sit there and think about it for a long time, but it's not just like a bunch of gross detail explained to you. As for like story building and world building in 1 sentence, which is hard to do, I really wanted this to sound like as if it was coming off an online recipe. Since nobody actually reads like the full fucking paragraph, they just look for like the mini instructions. I feel like something this malicious wouldn't be caught right away, and also I feel like this shows that this person has done this before and is encouraging others to do it as well. For my other 1-sentence horror story, you won't know your breaks have been cut until you need them. Not only is this just a super creepy thing that I think about a lot, this being a quoted sentence as if somebody is saying it to you is pretty much a threat. Not only is this a threat, but you also have a little bit of the personality who is making this threat to you. They're bold enough to make a threat, but they're clever enough to not say it directly. You can tell me which one you like better, but I'm leaning towards the sanding sugar one. I don't know if it would work for most people because I don't think a lot of people know what sanding sugar is, but it really legitimately just looks like crushed glass. Now we're getting into 2-sentence horror stories. As I said before, I really think these were some of the best. There were definitely a few stories on Reddit that I actually enjoyed, one of my favorites being, I don't remember exactly what it is because I don't have Reddit pulled up, but it goes pretty much like, be careful not to move the line of salt, that's what keeps them out, and then the other person says, sea salt is what keeps us out, as they cross into the home. This is a great short story. The implied creepiness has such a bigger effect than just putting all of the most disgusting words you can think of in a sentence. Again, there's like a whole bunch of world building going on in these 2 simple sentences. There's some kind of monster that's roaming the world. People think they know how to do it, but they're not 100% sure, and then these monsters are very smug. And also, they look human. By far the best story I read the entire time I was on Reddit looking at these. There were a few other ones I liked. Again, that whole setup followed by a twist in the next sentence is a really good format to tell a good story. I will say though, I don't think my 2-sentence story compares to the sea salt story. And this was at the very beginning of my writing, so I wasn't actually in the mood to write anything creepy yet. So I do think it's very lackluster, but I'll read it to you. I've covered every camera on every piece of technology that I have in my apartment. How is my ex still describing all of my outfits in exact detail? Again, this one's not really my favorite that I wrote last night. It's definitely creepy, and it definitely follows a theme that was on Reddit, which is stalking. There's so much just stalking in the subreddit. That being said, this is a real fear that I have. All of the cameras on all of my technology, unless I'm like actively using them, is always covered by something. For world building, we have very clearly this person has been harassed for a while. Their ex is very clearly stalking them and obsessed with them and hiding cameras somewhere, or actively looking at them physically with no technology involved. Also, it's very clear that no matter what this person does, they cannot cut contact with their ex. Even if they tried before, their ex is still finding some way to talk to them. Very creepy, not a fun time. I found the wording of this one kind of hard to get right. Because it had to be 2 sentences, I had to make it very clear what was happening. The second sentence especially, I was having a hard time making it very clear that the ex was visibly seeing this person. So I used the word outfit to describe like what they're wearing every day. I couldn't think of anything better at the time, but I feel like there's something I could say that would make it better, but that's what I have for now. If the 2-sentence horror stories were the best, I'd say the 3-sentence horror stories were the second best. Again, you set up in your first line, and you do the twist in your last line, and you can use that middle line to either build out the world and build out your characters, or you use it to enhance the twist. However, for me, I still don't think this was one of my best ones. I think the story that I picked for this one couldn't really be explained in 3 sentences properly. I think the concept I picked was just a little bit too much for the scope of 3 simple sentences. I was having a really hard time parsing down all of the details into 3 simple sentences. Again, I still don't think this one really works, but I did my best, and it is a very creepy concept that I do think about constantly. After coming home from work, I sent my roommate an angry text about leaving the apartment door unlocked again. It wasn't until I was already in my room that they answered. They had triple-checked that it was locked before they left. Like I said earlier, not the best. I feel like the ending's kind of weak. Obviously, the twist is somebody has broken into the apartment, but I feel like there wasn't enough established with the 2 characters to begin with. This could easily be explained away as the roommate simply did forget again. I mean, the roommate could simply just be lying. It could be explained that somebody else that already has the keys in the apartment. It's not the best. It's definitely creepy, but I don't think it was set up well enough, and I don't think the twist is strong enough. But I racked my brain over this one, and I couldn't find a better way to state it. The original thought is that the roommate had never left the apartment in the first place, but in that case, then maybe the person who was coming home had forgotten to lock the door. There are too many variables in this one for me to feel satisfied with the way that it ends. Definitely not my best work, but I think from here on out we're gonna start getting better and better and better. And also, the sentences get a lot longer, which I think is another problem with a lot of these Reddit short stories. Something I noted with these short stories is that the sentences were also very short. Now, in a lot of these subreddits, there are specific rules against run-on sentences and that kind of stuff. Like, your sentence has to be grammatically correct. At the same time, however, if you've ever read a book by an English author, you know sentences can go for so damn long and still be technically grammatically correct. I feel like some of these stories could have been helped if they just stuck in a little bit more detail into the sentences they already had. Anyways, I think sentence 4 on is when I start really getting into my groove, but also at this point they're getting less and less challenging the more sentences we add. The main 3 on Reddit are 1, 2, and 3, and we're already on 4 that had maybe 600 people in the subreddit. So I think at 4 sentences, the challenging nature of this has kind of worn off at this point. 4 sentences simply is not challenging enough for the people on Reddit. There were hardly any entries on this subreddit. None of them were good, honestly, in my opinion. So we're just gonna go ahead and read mine. This is something I thought about this morning. Despite the Texas heat, I can't sleep without a blanket. Even with my bed lofted to be directly beneath the AC vent, I wake up sweaty head to toe. The rungs of the metal ladder seem extra slippery this morning, but I still start the climb down. I forgot about the sharp corners of the desk below me until gravity slams my head into it. As you can see, I do in fact have a lofted bed with a metal frame, and it is Texas and my feet get very sweaty, so every time I climb down that ladder, I do freak out a little bit. Now, I'm smart enough not to keep anything where I could bash my head against if I fell down around my ladder, but this morning I was just imagining, if there was something, really sharp or really, hard, and I slipped and cracked my head open, that's not a good way to die. Probably not the scariest, but it's scary for me to think about. For 5, 6, and 7, there's hardly a Reddit presence at all. There is a subreddit, but there's hardly any posts, and the few people that have been posting on them seem to be fighting with each other. So there's really not much to say about them, other than a lot of people are very annoyed when their post does not get upvotes. There's 2 people on this subreddit, dude. What did you expect? Anyways, here's my 5-sentence horror story. I smoothed down the baby hairs to try and keep them from flying into my face during my day. He's staring at me, like usual, with those cold eyes. He taps the ashes off the cigarette onto the bathroom floor, even though I've begged him not to smoke in the house. I tell myself to just ignore him as he flicks the lighter on and off, trying to freak me out. I pick up my hairspray, and as soon as I press down the nozzle, he jams the lighter in front of it. This one I struggled with the most. I feel like the story is very clear. The ending is absolutely horrifying to think about. I just don't like the way it's worded. I reworked the last 2 lines so many times. The word jams, especially for me, isn't working, and I don't know what else would work better in its place. It was really hard for me to figure out how to properly describe somebody very rapidly sticking a lighter in front of somebody spraying hairspray. The idea, of course, is she's holding her hairspray out like this, and as soon as she presses down, he sticks the lighter in between that. But I couldn't find the way to properly describe that. At first, the lighter wasn't even mentioned until the very last sentence, but then I put it in a little bit earlier on in the story to kind of like establish the fact that he is playing with the lighter in the room that she's in. I don't know, there's just something about that last line. It's not quite there, it doesn't quite hit for me, but I just straight up could not think of another way to word it without it being like too wordy. For the 6-sentence horror stories, if I remember correctly, there's actually no stories at all posted on Reddit under 6-sentence horror stories. The subreddit exists, but there's no stories under there. So instead, we're just gonna do mine. I had been careful and done my research. Unsurprisingly, there wasn't too much information on this specific situation. I couldn't tell anyone else because they would definitely think I was crazy. I was sure I was making the right choice. I placed my hand on my reflection in the mirror. It wasn't until it grabbed my wrist that I understood my mistake. I know I sound like a broken record, but I'm not 100% happy with this story either. And there's actually a pretty good reason as to why I'm not 100% happy with this one. This is actually a condensed version of a different story that I've already written. I think I originally wrote this story when I was in like high school. It's like 3 pages long. It's still a short story, but it's not this short, obviously. My short story is about a mirror that swaps people back and forth, and then when you get swapped into the mirror, you're stuck in the form of the person that you swapped with. The story that I wrote in high school is actually from the perspective of the person in the mirror. They're trying to trick somebody into touching the mirror so they can take over that person's body and be out in the real world again. The person in the mirror themselves had been tricked to get in there in the first place, and though they originally tried to just like bargain with people and be truthful, they realized after centuries and centuries of being stuck in a mirror that it wasn't going to work, and the only way they were going to get out was to trick somebody else. I really like that story. I'm pretty proud of it. And this one is just like a variation on that, honestly. It's very clearly from the perspective on the outside of the mirror that is now getting tricked into the mirror. And since it's only 6 sentences long, it's not nearly as detailed as my 3-page long story is. I like this one, but not nearly as much as I like the other one, especially since the other one is from a perspective of somebody who's gone crazy from being stuck in a mirror for centuries on end. That one was definitely more fun to write, but this one is still good, just not as good. And now we're finally on to our 7-sentence horror story. With barely any people even joined the subreddit, and absolutely no posts, I will be the first person on record writing a 7-sentence horror story. This one I think is the most mysterious and the most open to interpretation, while being the most complete at the same time. Probably because it's 7 sentences instead of just 2. This one was definitely one of the easiest and the most fulfilling to write, and I think there's a good amount of build-up and suspense that leads to that final last line. There were a few parts in the story that got reworked like once or twice, but I'm pretty happy with the way it turned out. You qualify for an experimental procedure. The doctor was grinning, but there was nothing behind his eyes. I reluctantly agreed, since there was really no other option. The nurses who wheeled me to the new room refused to talk to me, but kept eyeing each other as if I wouldn't notice. You won't mind if a few med students join us? But I couldn't answer since my head was already shoved in the cold machine. I heard so many feet shuffling into the room, so many quiet voices, and I felt so many different pairs of hands holding me in place. My heart was racing as the whirling of the machine ramped up, making it impossible for me to hear the people in the room, and for them to hear me. At least, I assumed they couldn't hear me, since they did nothing as I screamed. I think this story would have been perfect if I had had 1 extra sentence. There were definitely some places where I cheated a little bit, and I think with a tiny bit more leeway, this could have been really, really well done. I think this has a really good building of suspense. There's a lot of mystery involved. What kind of experiment exactly is going on? Why does this person feel like they have no other option? What do the nurses know? Who are these med students that this person couldn't see because they were already trapped inside some sort of machinery? The spectacle of being viewed in a medical procedure just freaks me the fuck out. The idea of not really knowing what's going on during a medical procedure is another thing that like really worries me and freaks me out. Just the idea of being in the dark, in this case literally, about what's going on to me, to my body, it's all heebie-jeebies for me, honestly. Again, this to me is what horror should be. And yeah, you might want to call it thriller instead of horror. But like, there's no gore actually described. There's definitely a lot left up to the imagination, and there's a lot of this building tension, but there's not just like gross imagery. Or even if there is gross imagery, it's not just like overly indulged and detailed. It's not torture porn. For The Black Phone, I had to look up the definition of horror because I don't think that movie should have qualified as a horror. And anything can be a horror as long as it had the intention to be scary, which is such a super lax definition. But while that is still the definition of horror, this is gonna have to count as horror because it was made with the intention to be scary. And this is the kind of horror that I can get behind, where there's an actual story and it's not just grossness, just so much gross. So many of the stories on Reddit just kind of boiled down to, wouldn't it be horrible if you were raped? Wouldn't it be horrible if you were killed? Or here's somebody being killed, or if you had the choice, would you kill your mom or your child? Like, I wrote a stalking story, so stalking is not off the table for me, clearly. I think the main difference is the stories on Reddit were simply an example of stalking, not necessarily a story that involved stalking. Like, there's a big difference. But there's still a difference between a story that just has a rape scene in it and just somebody threatening to rape somebody else. That's not a horror story, that's just a horrible thing that happens to people. I honestly don't know if I'll ever be a fan of the horror genre just because there's so much of that kind of bullshit in there. So that's kind of why I say I like thrillers, because, you know, I do. If it's a good story, I like it. But it can be just so hard to find a good story in a genre that relies so much on strictly shock value. And that's all I wrote. I was gonna write an 8-sentence horror story because there's not even a subreddit for that one, and also 8 is my lucky number. And I did end up actually writing 8 stories because I wrote 2 1-sentence horror stories. But by that time I was actually like very tired because it was 3 o'clock in the morning. And also something else kind of spooky is I originally actually all wrote these on the notes app in my phone because I was supposed to be going to sleep, so I was in bed. So I had to transfer them all over to this little notebook so that I could record on my phone and still read these out. So as I was copying them over into my phone, I was also at the same time feeding my lizard that's right over there. But he's a pain in the ass. So I had to put all his mealworms in a bowl, but they kept crawling out, so I would have to like get up and go put them back in the bowl because he won't eat anything dead. It has to be moving. Like, also he's scared of the tongs, so it has to be in a bowl. He's a drama queen. Anyway, so I was like sitting here writing, and then I'd have to like check and then I'd get up and move the mealworms. And I originally started out using this pencil, and I got up to move some mealworms, and when I came back, my pencil was missing. It's like completely gone. Couldn't find it anywhere. Looked all over my desk and the floor and the shelves. Couldn't find it. And I was like, well, that's weird, but also like I lose absolutely everything all the time. I will lose my phone while I'm using it. So then I just started using this pen that I just had on my desk and just kept going. And then the mealworms decided to crawl out of the dish again, so I had to go over there to fix that again. And when I came back, the pen was missing. It was completely gone. Same thing that had happened to the pencil. Not on my desk, not on the floor, not on the shelves, not in my chair, not in my pocket. Could not find it anywhere. Completely disappeared. And at that point, I was like, that's pretty spooky. Where are my pens going? But I have a little bit of a saying. Once is a coincidence, twice is weird, 3 times something's up. So I got a new pen, this purple one. It's in my little jar that I keep on my shelf. And I only had the 7-sentence horror story left, so I just wrote that one out. And then I looked over it and the mealworms were all coming out of the desk again. So I went over there, and I had left both these 2 things on top of his cage, and I hadn't even noticed. I was scouring the whole area, tearing everything up, trying to find him, and they were just sitting right over there on top of his tank. So no ghosts. Nothing weird. I'm just dumb. But I hope you all enjoyed this video. I had a fun time. This was actually pretty challenging for some of these. And like I said, these could definitely be worked on and improved. They're not the best. I still think they're better than most of those Reddit stories though. But let me know which one you liked the best. And let me know if I should start an 8-sentence horror story subreddit. But that's all I have for this video, so I will see you all in the next one.